You are listening to podcast Madar.
Amnesty International new report that designated Israel as a state of apartheid is added to a long and welcomed queue of reports launched by international Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations. However, our guest, Professor Neve Gordon, who definitely welcomed these reports, contend that they missed an important piece of the puzzle. Instead of accusing the State of Israel as the solo and prominent actor in conducting apartheid practices, Gordon adopts a sociological lens and reveals the collaborating role of tens of Israeli and pro-Israeli civil society organizations who are affiliated with the far-right wings and the fascist ideologies. These organizations that operate inside Israel but also on the international arena conceal the crimes of Israel and try to present it as a liberal state. Neve Gordon, who will be speaking with us on the role of many civil society organizations that participate in enabling the Israeli apartheid, is a professor of international law and human rights in Queen Mary University of London. His research focuses on international humanitarian law, human rights, new warfare technologies, the ethics of violence, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. My name is Walid Habbas from the Palestinian Forum for Israeli Studies in Ramallah, and you are listening to Podcast Madar. Hello, Neve Gordon. In the 1st of February, Amnesty International also joined other international and Israeli human rights organizations and accused Israel in committing crime of an apartheid. How do you read these new voices that are being vocal about what's happening in Israel?
So first, maybe I'll begin with a bit of introduction. Since the 1960s, Palestinian intellectuals have been identifying between Zionism and racism. And over the years, beginning with the UN identification of Zionism and racism, and later different United Nations repertoires said that there was an apartheid in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but it was really only in 2017 that Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley, working for the United Nations, wrote the first report that accuses Israel of carrying out the crime of apartheid, not only in the territories it occupied in 1967, but actually from the Jordan Valley to the Mediterranean Sea. So this includes the Palestinian citizens of Israel, but also they included among these Palestinians, the Palestinian diaspora, the Palestinians that were ethnically cleansed in 1948 and were never allowed to return. And by not allowing them to return, as a manifestation of a racial law, Israel is also committing the crime of apartheid to these Palestinians, these millions of Palestinians. The second report was published 2 years later by a coalition of Palestinian NGOs who submitted a shadow report to the Committee of Racial Discrimination in the United Nations. And in that shadow report about racial discrimination, they made very similar claims to the Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley report from 2 years earlier, condemning Israel of carrying out the crime of apartheid. In the wake of these two reports, human rights organization in Israel, First B'Tselem, with an 8-page report from last year, followed by a 260-page report by Human Rights Watch, and then this past week, a report by Amnesty International.
As Israel faces international condemnation for its assault on Gaza, we turn to look at growing accusations that Israel is an apartheid state. In March, the organization Human Rights Watch said for the first time Israel is committing the crimes of apartheid and persecution in the occupied Palestinian territories. Before that, in January, the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem issued a report titled A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea.
Amnesty International is here today to call on the authorities of Israel to put an end to the system of apartheid.
Now, all these reports do quite an amazing job in tracing how Israel's laws, policies, and practices fit the bill of the crime of apartheid. And they charged the Israeli state of carrying out the crime of apartheid. But what they are looking at is only the actions of the state. What they are looking at is legislation, policy, and practices of the state. And this is based on what I think is a misconception of how we understand society, where the state is the oppressor and the site where domination is, or the government is, and civil society is the site of freedom, of human rights. And it is the government that is the major, if not only, culprit in violating human rights. And this is the liberal imagination of what goes on. And so less government, or a certain amount of government, is required to regulate society. But if there's an overreach of government, it is a violation. And in this case, it's one dominant racial group dominating another racial group, so it fits the label of apartheid. But actually, we know from, let's say, Antonio Gramsci, that that's not how things work. That the state is made up not only of government, which uses coercion in order to advance its needs or its hegemonic project, but the state is also made up of civil society. And the role of civil society is to create consensus for the state's hegemonic project. And if the hegemonic project is an apartheid regime, then there are many civil society actors whose role it is to advance this hegemonic project. So what I'm claiming about these human rights reports is not that what they say is wrong. I think what they say is right, but they're missing part of the picture. And that part of the picture is the role of Israeli and international civil society in enabling these laws, these policies, and these practices that are advanced by the Israeli government. So what I like to do is expose and analyze these civil society actors.
But are you sure that we need to stick, because of course we are like sociologically looking at the crime of apartheid, and we are not limiting it to the state in the liberal sense. And I agree with you, but are you sure that we need to stick with the notion of civil society when we talk about those organizations that back up an apartheid state and try to make a consensus about its practices and its oppression? So is civil society an accurate term here?
I think civil society is a very accurate term in the sense that it is or either voluntary organizations or organizations that operate that are non-governmental in essence, maybe have partnership with governments, maybe even sometimes are funded by governments, but for the most part are not and are trying to influence, and they do not, most of them do not work by using coercion, but they work through the manufacturing of consent. So in my project, I divide these civil society organizations into three groups. And I would like to note in the beginning already that some of these groups are very old. Some of these groups are pre-state groups. They're before the establishment of the State of Israel. And each group, I divide them according to their function. So the first group is a bit different than the two others because it actually contributes to the dispossession of the Palestinian people. And the major civil society organization that does that, and it is the harbinger of all the other civil society organizations, is the Jewish National Fund, the JNF. Now, this is a pre-state organization that just recently was complicit in the appropriation and expropriation of Palestinian land in the Nakab, Bedouin land in the Nakab, but it has modern manifestations. The JNF. It has El-Ad in Jerusalem, which dispossesses Palestinians in Sirwan. And it has, of course, Regavim that works both in the West Bank and throughout pre-1967 Israel and in East Jerusalem.
I would like also to note that last year they announced that the JNF also would start and try buying lands inside the West Bank. Explicitly, they agreed on this, and this was like an unprecedented decision because they are working now not only in the state of Israel but in all lands under the sovereignty of Israel.
Yes, I think they've actually been doing this for quite some time, but a year ago it became public.
Right.
But yes, but that is one group of organizations, civil society organizations. The second group is the Hasbara organization, the public relations organizations. And what they are interested in is protecting the reputation of Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, as a liberal democracy, and not as a settler colonial state or as an apartheid regime. And NGOs that belong in this group, I mean, the most famous today is NGO Monitor, but there are several other organizations that fit that bill, and it could be Forum Kohelet that works in Israel, but it could also be the different Jewish federations in the United States, and so forth. And the last group is NGOs that deal with lawfare. These are NGOs that support people that support the BDS campaign, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign. These are organizations that pursue the legislation of laws in in the United States, anti-BDS laws across the United States in different states. These are organizations that are also working very hard to change the judicial composition inside Israel, attacking the Supreme Court and trying to change the different judicial and legal institutions inside Israel. And so you have these three different kinds of organization with a bit of overlap between them that together can see their role as advancing Israel's hegemonic project.
Right. I would like also to add, and I'm not sure where can you categorize such a company or an organization which is called Concert. And Concert was like established within the Ministry of International Affairs. And 1 month ago, Yair Lapid devoted 100 million shekels for the work of this concert. And its main project is the Hasbara. And I'm not sure to what extent does the role of the state and these civil society organization overlap. I'm not trying to say that these civil society are orchestrated by the state. Of course, this is civil society, but to what extent they overlap with the project of the state in the Hasbara?
No. So Concert was created following the creation of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, a ministry that didn't last many years. I think it lasted maybe 7-8 years, and then was shut down and recently made into a department or a program in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Originally, Gilad Erdan, who was the second minister, I think, of Strategic Affairs, created Concert, and it was a failed attempt to create a network and a web that both, I think, monitors BDS activity on campuses in the United States and fights against it, but at the same time is also very much invested in what is called copy-paste legislation in the United States, where we have three kinds of anti-BDS laws in today, I think, close to 30 states in the United States. So it is about lobbying the state legislators in the different states in the United States to legislate laws that not only individuals can't support BDS, but more importantly, companies, corporations, pension funds cannot divest through their support of the anti-colonial or anti-apartheid campaign. What you see here is how a government is investing in civil society organizations, mostly outside of Israel, in order to influence legislation, policy, and carry out smear campaigns against the critics of Israel. What is interesting about this, or there are many things interesting about this, but one thing that is interesting about this is that this is the mirror of what, let's say, NGO Monitor says against B'Tselem.
Again, these are NIF NGOs, Israeli NGOs, which give legitimacy because they say we're Israeli, we're Jewish. Israel is an apartheid state. This is from B'Tselem. This is, let's say, the flagship organization of the Israel Fund. And this is their opening shot to legitimize what has become a massive campaign to demonize Israel as an apartheid state.
against B'Tselem, but also against many Palestinian human rights organizations. But in particular against B'Tselem, it says B'Tselem has lost its constituency in Israel. It has no real public support in Israel, and is getting external money from governments outside of Israel in order to try to influence Israeli policy. And what we see is how the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is trying to do the same thing outside of Israel, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, where I am right now, and in many European countries. So the idea is how to support certain civil society organizations outside of Israel, those that are pro-Israel, while at the same time trying to obstruct the work of civil society organizations that are critical of Israel in the United States, UK, and Europe.
Okay, can you please take us to make a zoom in and see how do these civil society organizations function? Because at the end of the day, these reports that accused Israel in the crime of apartheid should have consequences on Israel. But what we see is that this is not the case. For instance, NGO Monitor helped Israel accusing 6 Palestinian organizations as terror organizations and outlawed them, and provided the state of Israel with needed documents, testimonies, etc., to help the state in putting such a proclamation. So to what extent does the Israeli right-wing civil society or undermining the consequences of accusing Israel as a state of apartheid?
So on the one hand, they haven't succeeded. On the one hand, we have 5 reports now that accuse Israel of carrying out the crime of apartheid. We have major grassroots social movements that have picked up this label and are using it, from Jewish Voices for Peace in the United States to the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign in the UK. We have cultural influencers, from people like Bella and Gigi Hadid and Mona and Huda Katan, that again have picked up this label and are using it to criticize Israel. And here and there we have also different politicians, both inside Israel and outside, that are using it, and it becomes a justification for the BDS campaign and for other campaigns to stop Israel's rights abusive policies, etc. At the same time, you're absolutely right, because we see that there are both personal smear campaigns against people that have adopted it. We have lawsuits against people that use BDS against Israel. So we have a lawsuit against people that campaign Lord not to come and perform in Israel. We have Omar Shakir, the main author of the Human Rights Report, that is kicked out of Israel. And as you say in your question, we have the designation of the 6 Palestinian human rights and development organizations as terrorists. And this designation, as you intimated, is a act carried out by the Israeli government, but years before Defense Minister Gantz designated these organizations as terrorists, we have groups primarily like NGO Monitor, but not only NGO Monitor. We have Regavim. We have different groups outside of Israel, like UK Lawyers for Israel, or the Lawfare Project, that have been, I don't know if spying is the right word, because I think they have not placed moles. To the best of our knowledge, they have not placed moles in these organizations like other Israeli groups do. But they have been monitoring the work of these organizations, the people that work in these organizations. And here they've been using different mechanisms in order to blame them by association or to blame them in a frivolous way. Let me give you an example.
Yes.
We have the military court system in the West Bank. The conviction rate of the military court system in the West Bank is 99%. If you're a Palestinian and you're indicted, 99% you are going to be convicted. So it's not like a regular court of law where you go there and you might be convicted if there's evidence against you, and you will be not convicted if there's no evidence against you. This is a court that doesn't need evidence because 99% it convicts. So what the NGO Monitor is using, and here you see how the state and these civil society organizations work together. So let's say someone that works in a Palestinian human rights organization is arrested and brought to trial in a military court, and they say you're a member in the PFLP, in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And just a member. Now, in that court, you don't need evidence. So the court finds the person guilty of being a member, and we're not arguing whether PFLP is a terrorist organization or is not a terrorist, doesn't matter. The person is blamed for being a member in that organization. Israel has designated PFLP as a terrorist organization, even though we know that it has health clinics and human rights organizations and kindergartens, and it is a terrorist organization. You voted or support the PFLP, you were found guilty in a court of law, so to speak, and therefore the organization you work for is a terrorist organization. And that's the process NGO Monitor does. It looks at the proceedings of the military court, for example, finds that someone in El Haq or in Bisan or Adamir was tried for membership in PFLP, and therefore the whole organization, from their perspective, is a terrorist organization. They've been feeding this kind of knowledge to the government for many years now and pumping the government with this kind of information. And they've simultaneously been sending this information to the funders of the European funders of these organizations, asking them to stop funding these organizations. Now, these European funders are not stupid. They know that the military court's conviction rate is 99%. They know that NGO Monitor is trying to stop the production of knowledge about Israel's rights abusive policies in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And they know that the way to stop this, the production of this knowledge, is by stopping the oxygen from these organizations. So what you see is a concerted effort for years to go to the donors and tell them stop funding them. It didn't work. It failed. And when it failed, they went back to the Israeli government and said, we have failed. You need to help us some more. You need to designate them as terrorists. And so the government asked Shabak and the Mossad or whoever, I don't know, to find evidence. They couldn't. They couldn't find evidence because the European countries have been asking for evidence that these are terrorist organizations that are carrying terrorist crimes, and Israel hasn't produced any such evidence. And so it's all based on these military courts and then some accounting things that happened several years ago and are totally unrelated to anything. They might be corruption. I'm not saying there isn't corruption. There could be, but there's corruption in many organizations, as we know, and there's corruption in the Israeli government, as we know. I mean, the former prime minister is now in trial for corruption for 3 different issues.
This was very illustrative, but let us look more closely into these civil society organizations. And we at Madar have been tracing all types of these organizations, starting from NGO Monitor, Regavim, Kohelet, etc. But I'm not sure if these organizations emerged as a response to the threat of being labeled as an apartheid state. I mean, I'm not sure if this is only a counter discourse, because I have the inclination to say that from the very beginning of the establishment of the state of Israel as a settler colonial state, which has not yet resolved its conflict with the Palestinians. So I can see that the emergence of these organizations was inevitable. At some point, there should be voices inside Israel that back up the government by advancing a kind of human right discourse to back up the state of Israel. So how do you see these organizations in terms of their connection to the right and far right wings in Israel, because these are being expanding more and more to the extent that Israel now is a right-wing state?
So first, I completely agree. As I mentioned earlier, the kind of work these organizations do began even before the state was created. Now they are responding to the apartheid accusation, but they've been around for before the apartheid accusation, and they will be probably around after it. Now, you point to a certain paradox, and the paradox is that we have illiberal organizations that are fighting to defend a liberal image of an illiberal country. So we have illiberal organizations that are fighting to protect a liberal image, a reputation of Israel as the only liberal democracy in the Middle East, even though Israel is an illiberal country. And that's a paradox. And they are using liberal language to defend this non-existent liberal image, or this image that exists, but that they want to defend, to shield it from attacks. So what you have actually is civil society saying, both in Israel, a small group of counter-hegemonic civil society, you have Palestinian counter-hegemonic civil society, and then you have civil society outside of Israel saying Israel's not a liberal democracy. Israel is maybe a settler colonial state, maybe it's an apartheid regime, it's not a liberal democracy. Then you have NGO Monitor that believes that one racial group should dominate another racial group. You have Regavim that believes that one racial group should dominate another racial group. You have Kohelet, Forum Kohelet, that believes that one racial group should dominate another racial group. Namely, they are not liberals. They are not for the equality of all citizenry or all the inhabitants between the Jordan Valley and the Mediterranean Sea. but they are fighting for a liberal image of Israel. And in order to do that, they use all the weapons in the toolkit. So it can be pinkwashing, and it can be human rights, and it can be any tool that they think can be useful for this struggle, they will use. And so they present Israel as the capital of gay and lesbian rights. They present Israel or the settlers as people that are for civil rights, just like Martin Luther King was. They present anything they can use to justify a liberal conception of Israel. But what is really going on here is an attempt or a struggle over the meaning of democracy. And the question is whether we can think of a democracy not as a state for all its citizens, but as a state for a certain ethnic group or for a certain group of citizens. Now, in this sense, Israel and these groups are not necessarily saying something new. We know that in the modern and ancient history of democracy, many democracies were democracies only for a small group or for a group within their country. Think about the United States. The United States was a democracy even though a large portion of its populations were slaves, even though it carried out genocide against Native Americans. I mean, what they want to bring us back to a notion of democracy that is not a democracy where all the inhabitants have equal rights. It's a notion of democracy where only one group has equal rights and the other groups are subservient to it. And in this sense, Israel is at the forefront, but is not alone in this struggle and over the definition of democracy. I think Trump and I think Orban in Hungary have the same message. And that's why we see that there's an attraction towards Israel by these leaders, because they want what Israel wants. And that their, so to speak, democracy will be a democracy only for certain people and not other people that live within the same territory.
Yes, and Israel is also becoming like the ideal state in this regard. Like all these democracies, ethnic democracies, are considering Israel as the pioneering state. But talking up on the absolute level, I don't think there is a problem in having a democracy for one ethnic group. The problem might be, from my perspective, is how this group is establishing its relation with the other dominated groups. It's about the hierarchies and the domination. And in this context, when we go back to the paradox that you talked about, to what extent can these civil society organizations inside Israel continue to operate? Because this paradox sooner or later is going to exacerbate more and more. And I mean, the conditions of the apartheid in Israel are not static. They are intensifying more and more. So to what extent these civil societies can continue?
I think for many, many years. I mean, it's like capitalism that works through certain contradictions that it creates. I think, yes, the an apartheid regime produces many contradictions and many paradoxes, but it can also work through them for many, many years. And I think that it really depends, because as you intimated, and as I said before, there is a kind of connection between Israel and other ideological movements outside it, from Modi in India, and as I mentioned before, to Hungary, to the United States, to Brazil. All across the world, we have these kinds of governing apparatuses, and they fortify and strengthen each other in the international arena. If Israel was alone in this sense, then maybe the paradoxes would have to play out, and maybe we could predict some kind of positive social change in the next few years. But I actually think that the notion that you can be a democracy and you can have one group that dominates over another group within that territory is becoming more popular in different segments around the globe. And so what we are actually seeing is an attack on the notion of equal citizenry around the globe. And the attack is coming from a kind of conjuncture between two forces. One force is the one we have been discussing here today, and that is the kind of ethnic, nationalist idea, that a proto-fascist idea that one group racial group can control another. But there's another force that feeds into it very well, and that is neoliberalism.
Yeah,
and what we see is this connection between apartheid and neoliberalism, and how they can work together in order each one to advance its own goals. And so I'm not sure that the paradoxes here are going to ultimately lead to a better situation. I think what we need to think about is how through collective action we can bring about this change. And what we see in the past few years is something very interesting, and we do see a change. In Israel and in the Palestinian territories, I think the situation is just getting worse.
Yeah, so it's not
civil
like
society, and we have the designation, as we mentioned before, of the 6 organizations as terrorist organizations. We have the hatred towards the Palestinian citizen of Israel that's just mounting, and the attacks on B'Tselem and other human rights organizations. But what we see outside Israel is a change. And the change is that civil society outside Israel is now more and more pro-Palestinian.
Mm-hmm.
Governments outside Israel are still where they were 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. They're pro-Israel. But the civil society movement in the United States, in the UK, in Europe, has changed. It supports the BDS campaign. It sees Israel as a human rights violator. And this civil society is pressuring their own representatives to make moves. And slowly what you see is the budding of young, mostly young, new representatives, whether it's in Congress in the United States, with the Squad, or whether it's in Ireland, or whether it's in Greece, or in France, or in the UK. We see young legislators and parliamentarians that have been influenced by civil society in their own countries, and they think of things differently. And from that, maybe a change will emerge someday.
We hope so. Thank you. And I think that the idea of this conjuncture between the apartheid and neoliberalism demands a separate episode on its own. This episode was very illustrative. I'm very appreciating your presence here with us. And thank you.